Welcome to this Tech Talk X series. My name is Guillaume Roels. I'm the Timken Chair in Global Technology and Innovation at INSEAD, and I'll be hosting the session today. Today's session is an analytics playbook for supply chain performance. This webinar is part of the Tech Talk X series by Digital at INSEAD. And this initiative is dedicated to exploring new technologies, their applications, as well as their impact on business and society and management. So for more information, visit the Digital at INSEAD website. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Accenture. Next slide, please, for the etiquette. So the webinar etiquette, you will be muted. The video is off, but the chat is wide open. You can use the Q&A tab to suggest questions for esteemed speakers. And as participants, you can vote the questions up so as to help us find the most relevant questions, which we are going to focus on in the Q&A at the end of this panel. The webinar is being recorded, and if you encounter any technical issues, email digital@insead.edu. Next slide, please. So it's our great pleasure today to welcome two esteemed panelists. First, let me introduce Angela Xu, who is the Chief Supply Chain Officer at Iveco Group. Prior to joining Iveco, Angela was at Lufthansa, where she was the Chief Procurement Officer. Angela has more than 25 years of experience in manufacturing, supply chain, procurement, and management consulting. So we are delighted that she'll be joining us today. And our second speaker, our second panelist is Stephan de Barse, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at O9 Solutions. O9 Solutions may not be a household name, but it is a unicorn, fast and growing, that is using artificial intelligence to provide operations and business planning solutions, serving the Fortune 500 companies. Next slide, please. So whenever we talk about information, this is all going to be analytics in supply chain. What are the use of analytics in supply chain? Analytics is used to make better decisions. And so part of my earlier work in research has been to quantify the efficiency or the loss of efficiency in decentralized supply chain. So we're moving away from sequential optimization to global optimization. So let me just describe a little bit what I have in mind. So in a traditional supply chain, decentralized supply chain, the different partners are going to make their decisions sequentially. So the retailer might see some demand, which would have some variability, and would optimize its inventory policy based on the demand it observes, perhaps taking advantage of economies of scale, taking advantage of price promotions. And as a result, the retailer is going to place some orders. So next animation, please, which the distributor is going to see. So next animation. And the distributor itself is going to optimize its inventory, again, taking advantage of economies of scale, pricing, and would place some orders. And as you can see already on this slide, there would typically be an increase in the variability of the orders as we move upstream in the supply chain. So this is the bullwhip effect, and the wholesaler in turn, so next animation, please, would optimize its system, place orders, and next animation, that again leads to more variability. Next animation, factory would do the same. And so it results in a lot of inefficiency in the chain. The proposed paradigm instead is to maximize the total supply chain. So next animation. So really to see the whole pie and make better decision on the actual demand information. So this is what analytics have been used for a long time. One of the earlier companies that really fight this bullwhip effect to use analytics was Barilla. So next animation, or next slide. And so Barilla in the 90s, by integrating these decisions in the supply chain and using analytics, was able to provide better service. As you can see on the left-hand side, the stockout rate went down dramatically at the start of the program, using less inventory, as we see on the right-hand side. So you get less inventory and better service. So this is in a way the holy grail of many supply chains. Now, this was 30 years ago. Let's fast forward. What are the uses of analytics today, and what are the different paradigms? And so what I see in practice is that there are actually two types of paradigms that companies have adopted. The first paradigm, let's move to the next slide, is an integrated paradigm. So in many, and I believe that this quote from the CEO of Foxconn, of the finance arm of Foxconn, illustrates that quite well. So in the supply chain, there are different flows. There are material flows, information flows, and financial flows. And these flows are typically disconnected, which leads to a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of functional silos, a lot of uncoordinated decisions. And so the first paradigm that we see is a paradigm towards integration of these flows together so that there is a little latency between the shipment decision and the actual information of that shipment decisions or the actual payment that is related to that shipment decision. So by removing the latency, we can make quicker decisions, we can increase the velocity of the supply chains. And of course, there are lots of technologies that enable this integration, blockchain being obviously one of them. So blockchain really supporting analytical decision-making in many supply chains. So the first paradigm that I see is towards greater integration of an entire supply chain on a common platform, be it a blockchain or any other information system platform. Now, there is a second paradigm, next slide, please, which operates in a little bit differently. Instead of leading to greater integration, the wholesalers, for instance, might try to collect information about the end consumer demand by observing the external factors that influence that external demand. So instead of relying on the retailers to give sales data, the wholesaler can try to capture that sales data directly. So let me talk about two particular applications that I have in mind. If you look at the right-hand side, just by using satellite image data, we can observe how many cars are on parking lots of a big retailer like Target. And based on this information, we can infer the sales of Target on that particular day. So I don't need to rely on Target giving me this sales information. Instead, I can capture that information directly. So notice that this is very different from the earlier paradigm that I mentioned, which was towards greater integration. Here, completely bypass Target to really collect information at the source. The second example it looks more at the supply side of the equation. There was a recent article in the New York Times last week about it. Instead of relying on my suppliers to certify that, for instance, their apparel has been sourced in good labor conditions, what I can do is that I can take the DNA of the product and identify where this product comes from. And of course, if we think about sustainability or good labor practices, this is another way to collect that information and ensure, certify that the product is conform to the standards to which we might adhere. So again, instead of relying on the supplier to provide this information, what we can do is completely bypass the supplier and collect this information from a DNA. So two different paradigms, and I hope that the panel today is going to discuss or contrast these different paradigms. Next slide. So this is all about information. Information is in a way the base layer of many decisions. What we aspire to get to is move away from information to knowledge and actual decision making, and leading platforms like JD.com, which is a leading platform in China, is moving in that direction. This is a slide that they showed to investors. They move away from a control tower 1.0, which was all about visualization and basic collaboration, to what they envision, Control Tower 2.0, which is value-driven, efficient collaboration. So the retailers like JD have been collaborating with major manufacturers like P&G to really integrate the system, lead to joint business planning, automate a lot of the decisions, most of the decisions, 80% of the decisions are fully automated, optimize jointly the pricing strategies, the replenishment. So that leads towards deep integration of these decisions. And again, the key idea is to maximize the whole pie instead of adopting sequential decision making. But analytics, despite its promises, is full of challenges. And next slide, please. We should keep in mind that technology is only one leg of these three-legged stool. We also need to rely on the people. We also need to rely on to have the right processes. And if we are missing the right skills, if we don't have the right incentives, technology can only go so far. It's not really about the technology, it's really how we deploy it, how we use it, and this is the purpose of this playbook today. So I would welcome Stephan and Angela to join me for the panel. And welcome, Angela and
Happy
Stephan.
to be here. Hello.
Hey, everyone. Happy to be here too.
So thank you very much for joining and for sharing your nuggets of knowledge about the analytics playbooks for supply chain. So the first question that I have, so I did mention a little bit the point of sales data and the Barilla story 30 years ago, but where do you see use of analytics nowadays in supply chain management? What kind of data is truly collected besides point of sales data nowadays? So maybe Angela, we can start with you.
Yes, thank you very much, Julian, to be having this opportunity to share some ideas from my side. In regards of data, what kind of data we are collecting right now as of today? I will start from very basic ones, right? The first one is, of course, the whole material availability, right? As supply chain has or procurement has, you always have to know where are my parts, right? For me, it's really the data brings full transparency from tier 1 suppliers, but also ideally for all your critical suppliers, we need to have visibility from tier 2 and tier X suppliers, right? So that we see some early warning signals in terms of planning purposes. Second one I can think about is really having material cost under control, right? I like to have data, or currently we're collecting data on really like real-time raw material inflation, how this impact our final products manufacturing costs. And this is the second one I feel very fundamental, very important. And third one, which is increasingly very recent years, is about risk management. The importance of disruptive supply chain and supply chain resilience is all about have a proper mapping about our risks. I think data, which is of course supporting our, let's say, knowledge on the supplier market, right? Financial stabilities, visibility of large M&A transactions, but also more and more like nature disasters. What happens when our supply chain is disrupted? Also, like recent pandemic situations, we need to have real-time data on, let's say, regional, global pandemic development situation, as well as some regional and country level restrictions, shutdowns. All this information, they come from all different sources. Therefore, to have that systematically throw it up into our, let's say, supply chain end-to-end solutions, this is very, very important. The next one you also mentioned, I think it's really about, due to legislation policies on, let's say, Good Supply Chain Act, right? There's a Supply Chain Act law already implemented early this year in Germany, for instance. We need to make sure that good labor practices across a whole value chain creation, but also to have a channel where our suppliers or sub-suppliers can raise their concerns, raise awareness, and bring those into our attention of management. Therefore, good data systems should provide us this kind of solutions. Last but not least, from my side, of course, the whole sustainability topic, right? How do we measure current supplier footprint, and how do we measure our CO2 footprints? Of course, therefore, making right decisions. I can think about a lot of on the sales operation planning, but I'd like to hand over to Stephan, who is a true expert on this. Therefore, Stephan, floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Give me 1 second, Stephan. So
yes,
I'd like
please.
to take this opportunity just to launch our first poll. Angela, you did mention the importance of getting to know your tier 1, tier 2, tier X suppliers. And I'm just curious to see from the participants how much knowledge they have about their different suppliers. So if you could fill out, what's your visibility on your tier 2 suppliers? You maybe know your names or you know a contact person. So I'd be curious to see how much knowledge you have about, we are not talking about the tier X suppliers, just the tier 2 suppliers. And I think that could be quite informative already for a panel. So meanwhile, while you are waiting for the results, maybe Stephan, you can share your knowledge about the different uses of data, perhaps complementing what Angela just said.
No, absolutely. And thanks, Guillaume, and also thanks, Angela. I think you shared a lot of very practical examples of what's really going on in business. I think how we look at it in any enterprise, there's sort of 4 big areas where new data is becoming available. Most downstream, it's all about how do we interact with the customer or with the consumer, depending on the business type we're in. And what we are seeing is that a lot of companies are trying to figure out, how can I build a direct and preferably digital relationship with my customer and consumer? Take Nike as an example. They move from traditional retail wholesale to a direct to consumer model, right? What does that allow them is to collect a lot of very rich data on, buying behavior of consumers, and so forth, right? So there's a whole movement out there that collects a lot of data about how do we deal with consumers and customers. That's one. Second is, what we are seeing is innovation at the product side. So for instance, we are working with a couple of medical device companies. So, they manufacture a medical device, it's put in a hospital, and then you attach a lot of different accessories to that device. What they did, they built IoT into the product. So every time an accessory gets attached to the product, there is a signal that comes back. So now, based on, for instance, the lifetime of that accessory, you can replenish to the hospital. It's a new use case because they have, in the design of the product, told about replenishing parts and accessories to hospitals. So new data source. Then what we are seeing on the sort of the supply chain, the core of the supply chain, there's manufacturing sites, there's distribution centers, warehouses. Those are all fully digitized, right? You get real-time track and trace, you get real-time information from your manufacturing lines, and so forth. So also a lot of new data sources coming from there. And then actually related to this question, there's a whole movement connecting the tier 1, the tier 2, even the tier 3s, to the core of supply chain operations. And again, getting a lot of data, not only about can actually my suppliers produce, but what's the remaining manufacturing capacity? What's the component availability? Angela talked about that, but also other aspects around, sustainability, around ESG types of metrics. So what we are finding is that companies, from how they deal with consumers, how they innovate their products, how they have digitized their operations, and how they're dealing with their upstream supply network, are becoming extremely data rich. I think the key challenges, and we talk about that later, how do we then actually leverage the data to improve decision making? And I think that's where there's a humongous opportunity to get better.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let's wait for the outcome of the polls. Do we have the outcomes? I haven't seen them. Okay, there we go. So okay, so unfortunately, and I think this is quite common, right? So 38% of the companies, the number I had was in mind, another survey that I saw was 35%. So that gets close to that, has no visibility on their tier 2 suppliers. Only 16% know their names. So it is quite limited, right? So, and you both Angela and Stephan, you did mention the importance of being able to map out the whole supply chain and even getting information about sustainability, labor practices. Clearly, if we don't have much visibility on tier 2 suppliers, this might be a big challenge. We are going to talk about that next. I also wanted to move now to the second poll that we had. If you could please launch it as well. And that relates, that is building a little bit on both what you said, Stephan and Angela. So some of it related to the demand side of the equation. So some of these digital technologies could be used for demand planning or product development, but other of these digital technologies could be used for supply planning or supply chain visibility. So I'm a little bit curious to see where most of the effort is nowadays, whether this is mostly on the demand side or mostly on the supply side. So if, again, the participants could fill in this poll, and then we are going to debrief on the results in a moment. So among the data that you have mentioned, I believe that some of it is hard data in terms of point of sales data, or sustainability would be mostly looking at carbon emissions or the real-time tracking of lead times in the supply chain. So all that is hard data, but I suppose there is also another aspect of today's data, which is fairly unstructured. As you said, Stephan, so the ability to come up with new designs of products, or Angela, you mentioned the labor practices that may not necessarily be quantitative or quantified as such. It might rely on different sources. So could you elaborate a little bit on the new sources of data generation that we are seeing in supply chain analytics nowadays?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think there's so many different data sources, right? I think, give you a couple of examples. What's very important in any supply chain is to understand what are your true lead times. Now, the problem is in a lot of organizations, those have been keyed into the ERP once, maybe updated once a year. But obviously, given all the volatility in the market, what you actually need is real-time lead time information. So now companies are investing in digital technologies to, for instance, get real-time track and trace data, like we all get when we order something from Amazon. Other examples, we are working with a very large coffee company, right? And one of the big sort of disruptors for them is one, weather, and two is local events. So assume, at the INSEAD campus, there is a big coffee store, right? The moment there is a graduation event, the store traffic will increase. Now, how do you capture the data? Because that, again, is extremely valuable, right? So I think there are like hundreds of different use cases of where new data sources are coming from. I think, Guillaume, that the challenges for organizations is there is this wealth of data, but they're not turning that data into knowledge. And what is actually the difference between data and knowledge? Let me give you an example. Let's say I have a forecast of 100, but my actuals came in at 80. So the first question that I have is, why did I miss the forecast? I have all the data, right? I put all the drivers in my forecast. I have this great data lake and so forth. I'm not able to easily answer that question, right? And very often, answering that question is about the collective knowledge of the planning function. So we call this the tribal knowledge. Someone might know, oh, that opportunity was canceled. Oh, the competitor introduced a new product and that was taking off. Oh, we actually had a supply shortage and that impacted us. So the problem is, while all the data is becoming available, we don't turn that into knowledge, right? And I think what we need to move towards is to say, okay, I have the data, I turn it into knowledge, and the knowledge need to support what we call the 3 or 4 W's. So the management questions. What has happened in my business? Then what is likely to happen? That's my forecast. And then what actions to take? And I think that is where a lot of AI, a lot of digital technologies are becoming available to support that transition from data to knowledge to improve decision making.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let's see the result of the poll first. Okay, so it is fairly divided. So I think the biggest winner, the main one is supply chain visibility, despite the fact that most participants don't have full visibility on their tier 2 suppliers. So that's actually quite interesting. Interestingly, also supply chain monitoring is less than the others. It was very big during COVID. So we see that memory fades in some ways. 2 years ago, supply chain disruption monitoring was very big on everybody's radar, but now it's a little bit lower. But it's interesting to see that it's fairly distributed across all these categories. Interesting aspect there. But as you said, Stephan, so the real question is not so we can close the poll now. I think the real question is not so much what kind of data we collect, but really what use of that data we make, and understanding, if possible, the causal relationship between the data and some of these outcomes that we have seen. And so that requires a lot of business knowledge. So Angela, I don't know if you'd like to complement that perspective on how do we move from data to knowledge.
Right. I think first of all, I would start even one step back, right? I would start with a trust. Trust is actually the foundation of building, let's say, successful relationships in private life, but also in business life, right? But where does trust come from? trust starts with sharing, right? If you don't share who you are, what's your value, what's your beliefs, you don't make friends, actually make real friends, right? And you also want to have friends who support you throughout good and bad times. The same in the business situations, right? Trust starts with sharing data, sharing information. At Iveco Group, for instance, we have one of our core values is we collaborate to win. We collaborate to win. That means we start with sharing information, sharing knowledges among, let's say, internal cross-functional partner departments so that we achieve, let's say, final targets jointly as a team. Because nobody can do one thing, everything. Therefore, we need this collective intelligence and strength to jointly approach the common goal of a company, right? This is the inside. Towards outside, I think suppliers as well as customers is one of the integral part of the whole value creation, right? Therefore, trust means we should move away from a transactional buy and sell relationship, but more to a partnership. Partnership means, again, sharing information, sharing visibility. At the end, we want to delight our end customers. Therefore, we and the suppliers are in the same boat, let's put it that way. Therefore, building a trustful working relationship is essential, right, to manage a proper supply chain. Last but not least, I would like to highlight what adds on to what Stephan said. It's not about keeping the information for yourself. Data has only power when you spread it, and also you can make really business decisions out of that, right? Therefore, I think it's about change management and mindset. How do you host data and where do you put this data? For instance, one of the practical terms I see is that in supply chain management, the seniority, the years you work in supply chain sometimes means a lot, right? Because it means you have experiences, you have practices, you have knowledge about suppliers, you have relationship with suppliers. Therefore, those information, these knowledges are captured in emails or in a piece of paper or in the people's minds, right? So I would say how we can maximize using those experiences which we collected over years and sometimes, let's say, ages, is to really capture those things via, let's say, storage of data. Turn stories into a data, and therefore we can also pass on through, education to our next generations. The newer people coming onto the job, they can learn it through, stored data. Therefore, knowledge management, I think, is a fundamental in supply chain management. Therefore, I think the challenge is really how do we capture them properly and systematically. How often do we update that? How often do we maintain them? How do we pass it on to our next generations? I think this is really quite, let's say, fundamental to managing the whole supply chain from a people perspective.
Right. So I fully agree with what you said. So in a way, again, to use the image of the three-legged stool that I showed earlier, right? So the whole the knowledge management that you're referring to is all the processes and the people legs of that stool, right? So we might have the beautiful data lake, but if we don't transfer that knowledge to the new generation, if we don't have knowledge management processes, that stool is not going to hold together. And again, to use the same analogy, I really like the notion of trust that you brought up, because I think that's a very important one. And again, with that metaphor, the trust would be the round circle on top of that stool, right? So this is what keeps everything together. And if we don't have trust, we just have three legs, and really nothing might come out of that. So really establishing that trust relationship is essential to make it happen in the supply chain. Stephan, so what other challenges have you seen? Because in a way, we live in a world where data is really abundant. As you said, we can collect a lot of weather data. I've mentioned some satellite imaging data. But I suppose it's also garbage in, garbage out, right? So this data is not always of good quality. We might not even understand where it really comes from. And that goes back to the W's that you've mentioned. So what are the other challenges that you've seen dealing with data, even perhaps internally in a company? So not necessarily talking about trust between a company and a supplier, but even internally within the company, what might be the challenges there?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of challenges when it comes to the data, right? I think the first one is the realization that there is way more data available than people actually expect to be available. Now, that data is in silos, different data lakes, Excel spreadsheets in the head of the people, and so forth. So there has to be a systematic way to actually get that data together. And then obviously, Guillaume, you mentioned this already, there's structured data, that sits in sort of the core systems of an organization, an ERP and CRM, whatever. And then there is unstructured data. And that unstructured data is mostly external data. And so hence the question, how do you connect the dots? And I think that's where companies are struggling. They also don't necessarily know what kind of digital technologies are out there to do something with the data and to turn that into knowledge. I think that's one. Then two is when we
let me interrupt you on this. So maybe it's a good time, a good segue to launch the poll for the participants. I believe it's poll number 3 to see what kind of tools they use in their company to manage to do the demand planning. And is it just an in-house tool, or is it based on Excel, or is it a more, I would say, legacy type of tool like SAP or ETU Open, or is it one of the newer tools like Kinaxis? Of course, I had O9 Solutions as part of it as being one of the mainstream tools nowadays, or up-and-coming tools. So it would be interesting to see, how do people really manage the data using these different tools that are out there. And so whenever we can get the outcome so that Stephan can continue his second argument. So usually I predict that most people would have either an in-house tool or Excel, but we are going to see in a moment what the outcome is. So whenever the poll outcome is ready, if you could please share it. All right, so what do we have? Actually, it's lower than what we usually have, but so we do have a lot of legacy tools, SAP being the biggest one. Still 22% of the companies are running demand planning on Excel, 15% in-house, which may sometimes be difficult to manage, but could also be the source of competitive advantage. So currently 0% are using O9 Solutions, but after this webinar, of course, we are going to convert many people there. And then Kinaxis is also one of the up-and-coming demand planning solutions in that space. So, okay, so Stephan, up to you. So we can close the poll now.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Guillaume. I think the other one is, so when we think about supply chain planning, right? A lot of times when we connect with organizations, right, they mostly use master data, right? I have my bill of material, I have my bill of capacity, I have my routings, I have my lead times, and so forth. But then a lot of times there are multiple ERP systems. The data is not clean. So again, how are we just sort of, first fixing the basics? And that's where we are saying, let's look at actually all the data that's available, transactional data, but for instance, also the real-time data around logistics lead times. Let's look into all those different data sources that we discussed. So the first step would then be to say, let's create some sort of a digital twin of the physical supply chain. Let's clean the master data so we get the basics, we get the true picture of our supply chain. And then when we mature in that process, right, we can look into adding those different data sources depending on the use cases, right? Because there's a use case around forecasting where I want to truly understand, the end consumer or the end customer demand. So I want to incorporate those drivers. When I look upstream in my supply chain, I want to understand where am I single sourced? What are the risks in my supply base? What is the confidence that I have that the supplier will deliver? And so forth and so forth. So I think it's, realization, there is a lot of data out there. Second is leverage the data to turn the sort of out of sync master data into representation of the supply chain, and then look at the different use cases and start leveraging the other different data sources for that. That would be sort of my summary. But we see companies struggling here, mostly because they actually underestimate that there's a lot of digital technologies out there that can support today.
Angela, do you also see that some major underestimation of or lack of understanding of what digital technologies could do nowadays to help you make better decisions?
Yeah, maybe not that necessary from my current company, but let's say according to my experiences and knowledges from my large supply chain network, I can add a few other challenges, right? One thing is usually before we start to implement a technology or tool, I believe we should first to understand what problem are we going to solve? What problem do we want to try to solve, right? Map them out, because some of the problems has nothing to do with tool. Some of the problem we try to solve is about collaboration, trust issues, personnel issues, process issues, right? Those are things which a tool cannot solve it for you, right? Therefore, I rather go first as to get the fundamental things right. Look at, is this a collaboration issue? Is it a personal issue? Is some, let's say, process issue, right? Because a tool cannot make a process working better if you don't want to optimize. So generally, my experience is always, before you implement tool, try to work out what is my current process, what is to be processes, and then help the tool can help you to much better, do the things quicker, right? Therefore, I think this is one of the fundamental challenges we have to really think about that. Second challenges I see across industries, speaking to some of my head of supply chain management, they always, let's say, difficult to find out what is my business case. What is the investment going to be quite costly usually? And then how do you demonstrate the business case? What do you get benefit out of that, right? Sometimes I think also missing the proper knowledges and skills to articulate the benefit coming from a tool which can help us doing this and that, right? So I think this needs a proper training, education in terms of the technology itself, the terminologies we're using today, and also to demonstrate in a, let's say, proper business case. Because at the end, our investors, our finance department, our shareholders always want to know a return of investment at the end, right? So I think it's also the second challenge is really about how do we communicate and make sure that those tools which we're going to implement really solve the issue at the end.
So it's interesting that you are highlighting all these skills that are needed to really make it happen, right? So because you say it's a lot of it is communication, but Stephan also mentioned the lack of technical knowledge might be, or lack of knowledge of the technical solutions might be another shortcomings. We also mentioned earlier the lack of business knowledge, right? To link, to make explicit the causal relationship between A and B. We get flooded with data, but at the end of the day, we need to ask the right hypothesis. You need to ask the right questions. And so that requires a lot of business knowledge. So it does seem that today in supply chain analytics, we need to have multidimensional aspects of skills, being at the same time a people person, being able to build relationships, to build trust, to communicate our findings, but at the same time being fairly technical and trying to understand the overall business. So is that something that you, Stephan, that you seem to be nodding? Is that something that you see also in your implementations, this kind of multi-skilled approach to supply chain analytics?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I like that, because what we are seeing at clients, especially when we do the big transformations, is that today, right, if you look at any planning organization, there are demand planners, there are supply planners, there are production planners and so forth. But what is kind of missing, Guillaume, what we are finding is, so if you look at technology companies, right, every technology company, for every sort of solution set they have what they call a product manager, right? So that person is responsible for that product. When you look at an organization that's not technology, right, they have different processes. So they have a process for demand planning, and then they have different demand planners. But what's actually missing is the product manager for demand planning. In other words, that should be someone that is technology savvy, but that can also be a coach in sort of, articulating, what should be the future process enabled by technology, and then bringing the people along. But also that process will likely change again in 3 months, in 6 months, and 9 months, depending on sort of the speed of change in the business. So that is a sort of evolving process, and hence we should think about that process as a product and have a product manager that can, is tech savvy, understands the process, and it can take the people along. But ultimately, I think Angela made a very important comment, and it's all about what is the business problem that I'm trying to solve. Some companies, they have a massive backlog, right? So we can talk about using different drivers to improve the forecast, but that's not the problem today. The problem is supply allocation and getting a better perspective on, can my suppliers actually deliver? Others, right, are facing extreme volatility on the demand side. So they're all about, okay, how can I actually improve right my forecast by incorporating drivers and using AI, ML, and so forth. So that gives you a little bit of perspective. I think Angela, great comment there on where to focus on.
Yeah, just to add on to Stephan, what you said, indeed, actually, it's also a little bit leadership's task to make sure that our organization are well informed what problem we want to solve, but also sometimes people just have like a little bit like fear about what's coming new, right? This technology, I have no idea. This technology going to take away my job, right? These are normal human being behaviors. So from that perspective, we should have a great understanding. There, let's say, hidden, this big elephant in the room has to be addressed before you do any change management, right? It's a basic fundamental change management. Therefore, having the people much more, let's say, get familiar, get hands-on with some tools is one thing. The other one is to also to properly communicate. Once you free up yourself, if you really, let's say, implement some automatic tools and processes, you will free up some resources and time that you can do something much more value add, more supplier partnerships, much more visiting suppliers, much more other things to do, right? So taking a fear out of the system, I think is very, very important, but it's a leadership task, it's a management task of it.
I really like this back to basics type of approach and relating it to the management fundamentals, right? Trying to really make a business case of the value of analytics and seeing that more as an opportunity rather than cost cutting or, as we said, so managing the fear of losing the jobs. So I'd like to encourage now the participants to post some questions. We are slowly getting towards the Q&A. So if you could please take the time to put some questions in the Q&A chat and upvote some of the questions that you'd like us to answer. But meanwhile, I'd like to think about the future of supply chain analytics. We did mention blockchain early on. We also mentioned the idea of digital twins. So what would be the future, and potentially would that be also in the space of sustainability? So maybe Angela, if you want to go first and talk about maybe potential users of supply chain analytics for sustainability purposes. You did mention that in the earlier part of the talk.
Right. I think first of all, any technology and tools could help us to make much better supply chain decisions, right? It starts with when you think about where to source and how to transport those physical goods, right? As long as you buy physical goods, you still think about your supply footprint, where the factory has to be set up. So I think this helps really a fundamental, let's say, decision-making processes. Second, I think it's really about, let's say, fact-based calculations, right? When you go down this route or you travel with another route, what could be the CO2 impact at the end? I believe fundamentally all supply chain professionals want to do some, let's say, proper job, contributing to CSR and sustainability topics. But we need really good visibility, but also alternatives, right? What are the alternative options? What are different scenario plannings that we can make proper let's say, judgment to what lane do we travel with our goods, right? Last but not least, I think technology should not be limited to your own functions in supply chain. It has to go really cross-functionally in your company, as well as go beyond your companies. Look at the customer side, look at the supplier side. How can we connect with each other much more digitally, sharing true, really real-time information, and therefore cross industries at the end, right? At the end, I think our end customer would be delighted if they know this products coming from our shops really have a high, let's say, integrity on sustainability aspects.
Stephan, anything on the sustainability dimension?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked about the three W's, right? So what happened in my business, sort of post gaming, what's likely to happen, which is the forecast, and then which actions to take. And that's where Angela mentioned it already. Scenario planning is coming up. So today it's like, okay, the demand can be 100 or 150. It depends on different risks and opportunities and assumptions. You then want to supply response and say, okay, can I make it? Yes, no. What's my cost to serve? What's my inventory risk? What's my material component risk? And so forth. And that should inform a decision. By the way, just getting that is very tough for organizations today. I think the next frontier is to actually incorporate ESG metrics into that decision making. So what we are seeing with a couple of our clients, where we say, look, we already have the digital twin of the supply chain. So we have modeled the factories, the DCs, the warehouses. But today we mostly model the constraints, right? Labor constraints, there's, machinery constraints and so forth. We model costs, obviously, and then we model planning policies, your inventory policies, you name it. Now, the opportunity is to also start adding ESG attributes to that. So what's the electricity usage in my manufacturing facility? What about water consumption and so forth, carbon and so forth and so forth. So then what you could say is, okay, the demand might not be 150, but 160. In order to do that, I need to expedite freight. So I need to use air travel. I also need to run on manufacturing side an overtime. And I might need to use, some expedite logistics as well. So you do not only then want to understand, my ability to fulfill the demand versus cost, but I think it becomes increasingly important to then also get sustainability data as part of that equation. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing, Angela talked about that, is the visibility to your partners in the supply chain, contract manufacturers, suppliers, co-packers, but also customers, and understanding what is their ESG score, as well as the risk that something upstream in my supply chain is outside the ESG sort of guidelines that I have for myself as an organization. And we see a lot of opportunity there as well. So I would say those are, two use cases that come to mind with this question, Guillaume.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think we are going to tackle the Q&A. The first question, which has received several votes, in a way relates to that, to ESG, thinking beyond efficiency and profitability, but is taking a more high-tech perspective to it, thinking about the uses of ML or maybe crypto, smart contracts. Have you seen? So of course we've seen some blockchain applications for traceability to collect sustainability data. I did mention also the DNA collection, also to get some sustainability data. But have you seen any uses also of machine learning or crypto in that space as well? Or is there any use case that might come to mind?
Personally, I haven't seen so much of that, other than I think the issue is, right? So the four walls of an organization, a company is already struggling quite a bit to actually get clean ESG data. But, that's something that's ongoing. The issue is scope 3, right? So everything that you do not control as an organization, it's your upstream tier 2s, tier 3s. So yes, there's a lot of talk about the blockchain in that regard. There's a lot of talk about other technologies. I think the key challenge there is, not only the data availability, the accuracy and trustworthiness of that data. There are a lot of companies out there that are trying to solve that problem. I think it will be solved. It will take some time. Will there be one or two winners? Probably. I don't know. But then again, right, the key question is, okay, I have the data, coming back to actually where we started. How do I turn that sustainability data into knowledge, and how does that inform my decisions? And that's where the trade-offs and the scenario planning come back into the equation.
Right. So in a way, sustainability, it's a new challenge, obviously, but the tools that we need to tackle sustainability are very much back to the fundamentals, right? So it's all about asking the right questions, cleaning up the data, getting to know your suppliers. As you said, the scope 3 is a big thing. So supply chain visibility remains a key word. So all these fundamentals that have always been very relevant, if the objective is to reduce costs or to improve quality, they become even more relevant whenever we talk about sustainability. So that doesn't go away, absolutely. And so I see that there is one question on visibility by Rafida. And I think that one would be for you, Angela. So of course, we saw from the poll that it's actually quite hard to get visibility on tier 2 suppliers. Many participants actually don't have it. And it does seem that to a extent that supply chain visibility is a buzzword. But what does it take to get visibility on these suppliers? I believe it builds on the notion of trust that you alluded to earlier.
Right. I think it starts with you have to explain your tier 1 supplier why you need the visibility of tier 2, right? In what context and for what usage? Again, I think here I would recommend and encourage everybody to be transparent, because the more the tier 1 understands your struggles, they are open to share. And I have experienced actually in the last years, it is possible, it is common. And of course, you need the tier one to work with you on that. So again, trust is the fundament to start with. Yeah.
Stephan, something to add on that? How do you get visibility on your supply? So in a way, O9 Solutions in a way takes a shortcut, right? So by looking at the outside world, and instead of relying on really on the suppliers, you factor in other dimensions that gives you clues about the state of the supplier, right? So
yeah, that's true. Ultimately, I think it's a triangulation game, right? There's data coming from suppliers, there's data coming from external sources. Ultimately, you try to sort of put that together in a knowledge model and say, look, this is the best estimate of what's going on. And then it's then all about the ability to then generate scenarios, right? What if this supplier fails? Am I confident enough that this contract manufacturer will deliver? And again, that is where we need to move from data into knowledge, because data would be, I know all the commits that I've ever got from a supplier. Knowledge would be my confidence level that supplier will actually deliver, and the knowledge that I have about what is the upstream risk of the supplier of my supplier. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that's where there is a big opportunity for companies to look at digital technologies to support them in their journey.
Okay, well, thank you. So another question for you, Stephan. So I think we haven't talked so much about ChatGPT, but of course this is the big hype since November. Does it affect at all supply chain analytics? It does seem that it's text analysis. Perhaps the concept of probabilistic answers might affect some of these AI tools that we face. But do you anticipate any application of ChatGPT in supply chain analytics?
No, absolutely. I think ultimately, right, what would be a ChatGPT use case in supply chain if we look at the future, right? It would be to ask, the system, can you please generate 3 demand scenarios and give me all the risks and opportunities? And please tell me, what is my supply response and what would you recommend to do, right? This today might take a month of manual work today. You're just asking that question, right? What is needed to get there, right, is actually everything we talked about. We need to collect the data. We need to turn that data into knowledge. We need to connect the processes, and we need to do that in a harmonized fashion that we can actually look at an end-to-end supply chain picture. I think that's very important. Now, I think what are some of the other AI techniques that we are seeing? And we talked about that with the clients. Let's say that we would get access to the emails of everyone that's in sales at a certain client. Likely, if we apply some AI technology, we will get a better sense when demand will be trending down or up by just reading through those emails by an AI bot, then actually waiting for that tribal knowledge to come in, because that's way too late, right? So there are ways to collect data from images, from emails, turn unstructured data into data that can be leveraged, and so forth. So I think the future of supply chain planning is all about this ChatGPT movement and more. So I think it's an extremely exciting space.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, the generative nature of these algorithms can also be useful for scenario generation, right? So in your digital twin, you could potentially generate some scenarios and stress test your supply chain to see perhaps different points of resilience or choke points, or to imagine different demand scenarios. So the probabilistic nature of these algorithms is very interesting for scenario generation, I suppose, right? So Angela, is that something we also discussing at all at Iveco or in your former job? So ChatGPT remains a bit outside.
No, not yet.
Yeah. So it does seem that we are still under the shock of this revolution, right? So we don't know if it's hype-ish or if it's going to lead to something more tangible. But definitely the backbone of the probabilistic nature of these algorithms sounds very interesting. So Angela, I do have a question for you from Hussein, who refers to data as being multidimensional. And I think what Hussein refers to is mostly the governance of data. in a way that goes back to your people aspect that you've highlighted quite a bit. So of course, not everybody should have access to the data. So we need to identify, okay, what kind of data goes where. Is that something that also is important to think about governance of data sharing, who has access to the data, and how we should dissect or combine data to maintain some form of security?
Of course, we have the GPTR, which is implemented recent years, right? So I think first of all, we have to follow what is the law requesting us, protecting data as much as needed. Second one, I go back to the collaboration with internal stakeholders and partners. Here you go with really like your business ethics, right? You know what you can share, what you don't share, right? Because nobody would say their fundamental understanding about what is confidential, what is not confidential, who do you want to inform, who cannot you inform. Non-disclosure agreement is always helpful in greater terms, right? The same with suppliers, right? You have to respect to what you can share. If a supplier is sharing you information or tier 2 suppliers, and you have to, let's say, follow the regulations and the rules, right? Because you have only one time to play. If you play it rightly, then you win the trust of the team. Otherwise, you will losing your ground actually, right? So I think basically, I think there's like general rules, the company rules, the policies and regional country rules, and the worldwide and global rules on whatever on data protection is necessary. On the basic things back in the company, you need to go with your business ethics. I think that's my common practice at the moment.
Yeah, so data is definitely gold, right? So and it's actually very hard to well, it cannot, it's as you rightly say, it may not be legal even to share data, and so we need to apply, you know, the legal frameworks in place to make sure that what is shared is legal, of course. But even despite these legal restrictions, of course, the companies want to keep the data for themselves and may not be willing to share the data because they may get a lot of intelligence out of it, and so there is always that concern that giving that intelligence to your supplier or to your distributor is in a way giving a little bit away your competitive advantage. And as you said, so what is key is to establish that trust relationship and to make sure that everybody can gain from that collaborative relationship, right? So which is not granted. It takes a lot of time and effort to make that case.
Also very important to have a common understanding about what is, let's say, data you can share, what data you cannot share. I liked actually in my past companies and also my knowledge about my networks. Usually it's very helpful if you have really awareness training. So awareness training about who the specific to the supply relationship front interfaces, what data you can share, what data you cannot share, right? I think this is really awareness training to a large population of supply chain community is very, very important.
Thank you. So I see one more question. We'll probably have only time for one more question. We want to finish on time, but so Emma is suggesting that nowadays the main objectives of many supply chains is on the one hand cost reduction, on the other hand supply chain security, and on the third hand, on the third finger, supply chain agility. And these objectives might conflict with each other. And so she's asking, okay, what's the use of data analytics to resolve these conflicts? In a way, that's the perfect business case, right? So this is really where you want to have data analytics to better understand the trade-offs and to see whether seeking more efficiency goes against agility or goes against security. So to better simulate these trade-offs, but I don't know if you'd like to build on that. I think the digital twins would be a perfect framework to start thinking about these various trade-offs. Maybe Stephan?
Yeah, and I keep it short given the time and let Angela finish, but I think Angela started there. It's the scenario planning, right? Do we want to invest in inventory? Yes or no? And what's the risk? Do you want to operate very lean? What's the risk that the supplier will not deliver, right? So agility and resilience, you need to balance them. It ultimately comes down to business decisions. What you need is, make well-informed decisions. You need the knowledge, right? So I'm coming back to turning the data into knowledge and using that for scenario planning so that we can sort of answer the 3 W's that we talked about. So Angela, over to you to...
Yes, yeah, I would also say a proper supply chain strategy always starts to understand fundamentally what is my overall company strategy. right? You start to understand what companies is on what journey. It's more cost reduction, or it's more EBIT, or it's more expanding, it's growing. So there are different, let's say, cycle of the company strategies. Therefore, the supply chain strategy always have to focus on that. Then you can understand your 3 pillars, what is most important for you. And therefore, you apply your right let's say, technologies to support doing that.
Okay, so again, we go back to the basics, and I really like that. Of course, that's the main motto of academia, right? So it's always going back to the management fundamentals and trying to understand how these different decisions relate to the management fundamentals, relate to the main strategy of the company. So I'd like to, I see it's 5 o'clock here in Fontainebleau, so I'd like to thank very much our esteemed speakers. So Angela, thank you very much. Stephan, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom of knowledge and really making this panel so lively. For the participants, please keep in mind that this has been recorded. The recording will be available on the website. You can go on the digital at INSEAD website for more information, and for upcoming seminars. I believe that there would be one coming up on May 3rd. So thank you very much to all. Have a good evening or good day if you are in America. And we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming webinars. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.